Welcome back to Reflections on Prayer. In the last video, we asked how we can respond to the voices that seek to destroy us, the devil, the world, and the flesh. In order to hear the right voice, we must cut off the devil's channels of communication, resist him with a firm grasp on truth, filter the claims of the world, and magnify the Spirit's voice over the flesh. We want to continue our discussion on listening to God by determining how he speaks. There is something within us that longs to hear God speak. Hearing him speak gives us direction with our biggest decisions. It gives us hope in the face of our biggest challenges. And it gives our life meaning knowing that the creator of the universe is talking to us. But I'm always challenged by the possibility that the voice in my head was just me, or that pull in my heart was just my desire. There's a real danger there. It can result in everything from a poor decision on choosing a mate to embracing a disastrous belief about the character or nature of God. Fortunately for us, God has given us a pattern to guide us in Scripture. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that this week's video will be a little content heavy. We'll be covering lots of Scripture and lots of ideas. Some of you love that kind of thing, and some of you hate it. Just keep in mind the goal is not to memorize every way God speaks and its relationship to the others. The goal is to expose ourselves to the ways God speaks, to create some familiarity with them and know how we might better receive them. So I encourage you to press through this video and feel free to pause and rewind to absorb some of the ideas as you see fit. Let's start out with covering some basic definitions. When I say revelation, you might be thinking of the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. But a revelation is simply some truth that God reveals to us about himself, his plans, or about us. It's basically anything that God says. There are several ways God reveals himself in the Bible. The first way he reveals himself is through a theophany, which is basically a manifestation of God that is visible to the naked eye. God reveals himself mostly in the Bible through prophecy. A popular view of prophecy is that it is a prediction of the future, and it could be that. But mostly prophecy is any message from God shared through another person. And that's a key to remember. No one receives a prophecy for himself. Prophecy is always a message of God mediated through another person. The Bible is a kind of prophecy that has been written down. And we can see that in 2 Peter 1:20, where the author uses the expression prophecy of Scripture. Visions were usually how prophets got their prophecies. Visions are mental perceptions given by God to an individual or a select group. I chose mental perceptions very carefully because despite what some say, a vision did not have to be seen by the naked eye. Scripture records instances where visions occurred in out-of-body experiences or in dreams, both of which don't utilize the naked eye. Peter himself contrasted the experience of a vision with reality when he followed an angel out of prison in Acts 12:9. Luke writes, he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. And visions weren't visual only. When Jesus called to a disciple, Ananias, in Acts 9:10, it says he called to him in a vision. But just because these visions were mental perceptions does not mean that they were any less real. Sometimes visions were accompanied by physical phenomena. And many times more than one person experienced the vision. Many angelic encounters occur in visions, which makes one wonder whether all angelic encounters ought to be classified as visions as well. Visions could occur independently, but they also took form in trances and dreams. Trances like the one Peter experienced on the rooftop in Acts chapter 10 were states in which the consciousness was partially suspended. The Greek word literally means to stand outside of yourself. Dreams were also vehicles for visions, but not all dreams are visions. The preacher writes in Ecclesiastes 5:7 that much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, fear God. The ancient Israelites often used a system called lots to determine God's will on a matter. Lots might be compared to casting dice to determine a choice, but it was a far more complex system. The high priest of Israel contained two stones in his breastplate called Urim and Thummim, which were used when Israel needed to consult God. Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord." Finally, an impression is not a word that we see used in the Bible, but it is possibly a phenomenon we see there. An impression describes an emotion that God gives us to communicate something. We'll explore this in more detail shortly. Let's take a look at the following illustration, which I call the revelation ladder. You'll see the different forms of revelation that we just spoke about, beginning with theophanies at the top, which I've labeled face-to-face encounters, using the language of the Bible. At the bottom of the ladder is impressions. The higher the form of revelation is on the ladder, the greater its objectivity is. And in most cases, the higher the form of revelation, the greater its importance is too. Note also the list to the left of the ladder that I call boosters. These aren't independent forms of revelation, but they do strengthen the objectivity of any revelation. So for instance, Paul says he was warned in every city that prison and hardships were facing him on his journey back to Jerusalem in Acts 20:22. Well, in 21:4, the disciples in Tyre, through the Spirit, urged Paul not to go to Jerusalem. And then while Paul was in Caesarea, a prophet named Agabus came down and prophesied that Paul would be bound and handed over to the Gentiles. Paul did not only experience one prophecy, he received many independent prophecies in different places, and at least one by someone who was officially recognized as a prophet. The reception of multiplied prophecies and a message from a validated prophet increased the objectivity of the message. In other situations, God validated a vision by giving a complementary vision to someone else, as with Paul and Ananias, and Peter and Cornelius. And God frequently gave signs, but with the possible exception of the story of Jonathan and his armor bearer in 1 Samuel 14:10, signs were not given as forms of revelation, but confirmation of revelation. God granted Gideon 3 signs, and 2 more than he deserved, in Judges 6. Not to give a message, but to prove the message. In any case, a message that accompanies a sign gets a boost in objectivity. Let's take a look at each form of revelation to demonstrate its place on the ladder and answer our question: how can I know that God is speaking and it's not just me? Read God's response to Miriam and Aaron's complaint against Moses in Numbers 12, 6 through 8. And read Hebrews 1, 1 through 2, and 1 Corinthians 13, 9 through 12. What can we learn about the face-to-face experience some had with God in comparison to prophecy? In Numbers 12, 6 through 8, we see that God reveals himself to prophets through visions and dreams. In verse 8, we learn that those prophecies are described as riddles and unclear. This is contrasted to the unique experience that Moses has given, a face-to-face experience with God. Now, this is not unlike what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 13, 9 through 12. Here he describes prophecy as a mirror. But what's important to know about mirrors in Paul's time was that they were fuzzy and unclear. Paul's promise is that what is fuzzy, which is prophecy, will give way to seeing face to face. Partial knowledge will give way to knowing fully. The Bible teaches elsewhere that no one has seen God. God is spirit, and he doesn't have a face. So face to face is a figure of speech describing clearness of communication and closeness. Only Moses had it during his time. And for all we know, Moses was the only one who experienced it in the Old Testament. We can never assume that other experiences with God, like Abraham's, was not mediated through angels or did not occur through a vision. Paul suggests that we will have it too, but not until that time when the perfect comes. But the author of Hebrews suggests that God has spoken face to face with one other person, which is why his message was greater than the prophets. In these last days, he says in chapter 1, verse 2, God has spoken to us by his Son. This face-to-face communication is important to note for three reasons. First, it's something we hope for but do not have. No matter how close we might become with God on earth, the best is yet to come. Number two, the face-to-face communication with Moses and Jesus was the source of the law and the gospel, respectively. Each would become the heartbeat of its testament, and each would become the test of all prophecy to follow. Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 3 says that if a prophet with a validated sign of wonder tells the people to violate the first commandment, they weren't to listen to that prophet. In the same way, in 1 Corinthians 12, 3, Paul affirms that the test of New Testament prophecy is its ability to affirm the gospel's central idea: Jesus is Lord. And thirdly, the face-to-face communications with Moses and Jesus were validated by the two greatest signs in history: the parting of the Red Sea and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. They got a boost in objectivity. The next rung down on our ladder is a logical one, the Bible. Although the Bible is a form of prophecy, it is an elevated form because it contains the message of the two people who were privileged to talk to God face to face, Moses and Jesus. We don't have the stone tablets anymore, and we only have the gospel of Jesus on the pages of the New Testament. But the Bible is an elevated form of prophecy because it explained and applied both the law and the gospel by credible witnesses and representatives who themselves were backed by signs and wonders. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 2:12, I preserved in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. So the Bible became the second most objective form of revelation because of its formation and its function. Its value for truth is underscored by Paul in 2 Timothy 3:16 when he says that all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. What about casting lots? I placed lots high on the ladder because they were used by the highest religious official in Israel, and they were used for replacing the 12th apostle. Something as haphazard as throwing dice at a problem doesn't seem all that objective, but casting lots removed the human interpretation from the equation, and there was some mysterious fail-safe built into the practice. When King Saul consulted lots over whether to go into battle against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 28, he didn't get an answer, which led him to pursue illicit forms of divination instead. Based on this and other ancient parallels, it's likely that the lot had to receive the same result after being cast multiple times to get an answer. Some say that the giving of the Spirit in Acts chapter 2 put an end to the need for casting lots, but Luke never indicates that the lot was viewed negatively, and this is simply an argument from silence. But personally, although I could never discredit the use of lots today, I wouldn't recommend them because we simply don't know what their practice was. Read 1 Corinthians 12:28 through 31 and 14:1 through 5. Why do you think prophecy has such a high value among the spiritual gifts? In the list of gifts given to the church, Paul lists prophets as second, right after apostles, before saying, "Now eagerly desire the greater gifts." In chapter 14, he picks up where he left off by encouraging his readers to eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Prophecy is distinguished from teaching in the list from 12:28, and its value is likely greater than teaching because teaching can be clouded by interpretation. Prophecy, on the other hand, is a direct message from God. The messenger can easily bring in his or her biases, which reinforces the value of multiple prophecies. But the messenger is at least free from the personal passions of the recipient's heart, which have to be interpreted through a web of motives and desires. The next rung on our ladder is visions. Visions, as I said, can take place in trances, dreams, or independently all by themselves. On several occasions, the Bible affirms that not all dreams contain visions, though. The weakness of visions alone as a form of revelation is suggested by Jude 8 when he refers to dreams. In the same way, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies. We saw that God moved in incredible ways through visions in Acts, but those visions were usually accompanied by another complementary vision or something else. The final rung on our ladder is impressions. Read Nehemiah 2:12, Luke 24:32, and Romans 5:5. What role do emotions play in guiding these people? It's hard to say whether impressions are substantially different than visions. We sometimes create a hard dichotomy between our thoughts and emotions that might not be so separate in the first place. But there are times in Scripture where feelings communicate something significant. Nehemiah said that God put something on his heart to do for Jerusalem. The disciples who encountered the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus later reflected that their hearts were burning within them when Jesus spoke and opened up the Scriptures. The pouring out of God's love into human hearts gives Christians confidence in their hope in Romans 5:5. These positive emotions, however, may be better classified as boosters that affirm already known truths. It's difficult, after all, for us to discern a developed idea from an emotion alone. Let's return to our big question for this session. How can I know that God is speaking and it's not just me? Remember 1 Thessalonians 5:19 through 21. Do not quench the Spirit. Do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test them all. Hold on to what's good and reject every kind of evil. Aside from that face-to-face encounter which we look forward to on the last day, God may speak to you on any point of the ladder. In Acts 9, a simple vision was enough to send the disciple Ananias into a potentially dangerous encounter with Saul of Tarsus. So discomfort alone should not cause us to ignore some form of revelation. But at the same time, we should seek more clarity, knowing that God has laid out a pattern of objectivity in scriptures. If you feel like God is leading you in a different direction, ask God for wisdom and be on the lookout in faith for ways that he might be laying out his path for you. Put the Bible first. Be open to God speaking to you. Seek clarity through objectivity and trust God for wisdom. See you in the next video.